Hello everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and today we are going to be continuing our reading of Emma by Jane Austen. When last we left Emma, she had received a visit from her sister and their family, Mr. and Mrs. John Knightley, I believe. The brother of the Mr. Knightley that we had met earlier in the series, who reprimanded Emma for her treatment of his friend Mr. Martin in persuading Harriet not to accept his proposal of marriage. That seems to be the case with many of these, is because they're based around family life, you have multiple characters that will be referred to, particularly with male characters, because this was the style at the time to use the honorific for them. Mr. So-and-so, and so you might have Mr. So-and-so Senior, Mr. So-and-so Junior. It all gets a little bit confusing, or at least it does when you read them this way. At any rate, I'm enjoying the story, and I think we should jump right in. Let's continue with the next chapter in Emma. Chapter 12. It begins thusly. Mr. Knightley was to dine with them, rather against the inclination of Mr. Woodhouse, who did not like that anyone should share with him in Isabella's first day. Emma's sense of right, however, had decided it, and besides the consideration of what was due to each brother, she had particular pleasure from the circumstance of the late disagreement between Mr. Knightley and herself in procuring him the proper invitation. She hoped they might now become friends again. She thought it was time to make up. Making up, indeed, would not do. She certainly had not been in the wrong, and he would never own that he had. Concession must be out of the question, but it was time to appear to forget that they had ever quarrelled, and she hoped it might rather assist the restoration of friendship, that when he came into the room she had one of the children with her, the youngest, a nice little girl about 8 months old, who was now making her first visit to Hartfield, and very happy to be danced about in her aunt's arms. It did assist, for though he began with grave looks and short questions, he was soon led on to talk of them all in the usual way, and to take the child out of her arms with all the unceremoniousness of perfect amity. Emma felt they were friends again, the conviction giving her at first great satisfaction, and then a little sauciness. She could not help saying, as he was admiring the baby, "What a comfort it is that we think alike about our nephews and nieces. As to men and women, our opinions are sometimes very different, but with regard to these children, I observe we never disagree." If you were as much guided by nature in your estimate of men and women, and as little under the power of fancy and whim in your dealings with them, as you are where these children are concerned, we might always think alike. To be sure, our discordancies must always arise from my being in the wrong. Yes, said he, smiling, and reason good. I was 16 years old when you were born. A material difference, then, she replied, and no doubt you were much my superior in judgment at that period of our lives, but does not the lapse of 21 years bring out understandings a good deal nearer? Yes, a good deal nearer. But still, not near enough to give me a chance of being right, if we think differently. I still have the advantage of you by 16 years' experience, and by not being a pretty young woman and a spoiled child. Come, my dear Emma, let us be friends, and say no more about it. Tell your aunt, little Emma, that she ought to set you a better example than be renewing old grievances, and that if she were not wrong before, she is now. "That's true," she cried, "very true. Little Emma, grow up a better woman than your aunt. Be infinitely cleverer, and not half so conceited. Now, Mr. Knightley, a word or two more, and I have done. As far as good intentions went, we were both right, and I must say that no efforts on my side of the argument have yet proved wrong. I only want to know that Mr. Martin is not very, very bitterly disappointed." "A man cannot be more so," was his short, full answer. "Oh, indeed, I am very sorry. Come, shake hands with me." This had just taken place, and with great cordiality, when John Knightley made his appearance, and "How do you do, George?" and "John, how are you?" succeeded in the true English style, burying under a calmness that seemed all but indifference the real attachment which would have led either of them, if requisite, to do everything for the good of the other. I love that line. I think that's great. The evening was quiet and conversable, as Mr. Woodhouse declined cards entirely for the sake of comfortable talk with his dear Isabella, and the little party made two natural divisions. On one side he and his daughter, on the other the two Mr. Knightleys, their subjects totally distinct, or very rarely mixing, and Emma only occasionally joining in one or the other. The brothers talked of their own concerns and pursuits, but principally of those of the elder, whose temper was by much the most communicative, and who was always the greater talker. As a magistrate, he had generally some point of law to consult John about, or at least some curious anecdote to give. And as a farmer, as keeping in hand the home farm at Donwell, he had to tell what every field was to bear next year, and to give all such local information as could not fail of being interesting to a brother whose home it had equally been the longest part of his life, and whose attachments were strong. The plan of a drain, the change of a fence, the felling of a tree, and the destination of every acre for wheat, turnips, or spring corn, were entered into with as much equality of interest by John as his cooler manners rendered possible, and if his willing brother ever left him anything to inquire about, his inquiries even approached a tone of eagerness. While they were thus comfortably occupied, Mr. Woodhouse was enjoying a full flow of happy regrets and fearful affection with his daughter. "My poor dear Isabella," said he, fondly taking her hand, and interrupting for a few moments her busy labours for some one of her 5 children. "How long it is, how terribly long, since you were here, and how tired you must be after your journey. You must go to bed early, my dear, and I recommend a little gruel to you before you go. You and I will have a nice basin of gruel together. My dear Emma, suppose we all have a little gruel." Emma could not suppose any such thing, knowing, as she did, that both the Mr. Knightleys were as unpersuadable on that article as herself, and 2 basins only were ordered. After a little more discourse in praise of gruel, with some wondering as its not being taken every evening by everybody, he proceeded to say, with an air of grave reflection, "It was an awkward business, my dear, your spending the autumn at Southend instead of coming here. I never had much opinion of the sea air." "Mr. Wingfield most strenuously recommended it, sir, or we should not have gone. He recommended it for all the children, but particularly for the weakness in little Bella's throat, both sea air and bathing." "Oh, my dear, but Perry had many doubts about the sea doing her any good, and as to myself, I have been long perfectly convinced, though perhaps I never told you so before, that the sea is very rarely of use to anybody. I'm sure it almost killed me once." Come, cried Emma, feeling this to be an unsafe subject. "I must beg you not to talk of the sea. It makes me envious and miserable, I who have never seen it. Southend is prohibited, if you please. My dear Isabella, I have not heard you make one inquiry after Mr. Perry yet, and he never forgets you." "Oh, good Mr. Perry! How is he, sir?"
"Why, pretty well, but not quite well. Poor Perry is bilious, and he has not time to take care of himself. He tells me that he has not time to take care of himself, which is very sad. But he is always wanted all round the country. I suppose there's not a man in such practice anywhere. But then there is not so clever an anywhere."
"And Mrs. Perry and the children? How are they? Do the children grow? I have a great regard for Mr. Perry. I hope he will be calling soon. He will be so pleased to see my little ones."
"I hope he'll be here tomorrow, for I have a question or two to ask him about myself of some consequence. And, my dear, whenever he comes, you had better let him look at little Bella's throat."
"Oh, my dear sir, her throat is so much better that I have hardly any uneasiness about it. Either bathing has been of the greatest service to her, or else it is to be attributed to an excellent embrocation of Mr. Wingfield's, which we have been applying at times ever since August."
"It's not very likely, my dear, that bathing should have been of use to her. And if I had known you were wanting an embrocation, I would have spoken to—"
"You seem to me to have forgotten Mr. and Mrs. and Miss Bates," said Emma. "I have not heard one inquiry after them." "Oh, the good Bateses! I am quite ashamed of myself. But you will mention them in most of your letters. I hope they're quite well. Good old Mrs. Bates! I'll call on her tomorrow and take my children. They are always so pleased to see my children. And that excellent Miss Bates! Such thorough worthy people. How are they, sir?"
"Why, pretty well, my dear, upon the whole. But poor Mrs. Bates has had a bad cold about a month ago."
"Oh, how sorry I am! But colds were never so prevalent as they have been this autumn. Mr. Wingfield told me that he had never known them more general or heavy, except when it has been quite an influenza."
"That has been a good deal the case, my dear, but not to the degree you mention. Perry says that colds have been very general, but not so heavy as he has very often known them in November. Perry does not call it altogether a sickly season."
"No, I do not know that Mr. Wingfield considers it very sickly, except—"
"Ah, my poor dear child, the truth is that in London it is always a sickly season. Nobody is healthy in London. Nobody can be. It's a dreadful thing to have you forced to live there, so far off, and the air so bad."
"No, indeed, we are not at all in a bad air. Our part of London is so very superior to most others. You must not confound us with London in general, my dear sir. The neighbourhood of Brunswick Square is very different from almost all the rest. We're so very airy. I should be unwilling, I own, to live in any other part of the town. There is hardly any other I could be satisfied to have my children in, but we are so remarkably airy. Mr. Wingfield thinks the vicinity of Brunswick Square decidedly the most favourable as to air."
"Oh, my dear, it is not like Hartfield. You make the best of it, but after you have been a week at Hartfield you are all of you different creatures. You do not look like the same. Now, I cannot say that I think you're any of you looking well at present."
"Oh, I'm sorry to hear you say so, sir. But I assure you, excepting those little nervous headaches and palpitations which I am never entirely free from anywhere, I am quite well myself. And if the children were rather pale before they went to bed, it was only because they were a little more tired than usual from their journey and the happiness of coming.
I hope you will think better of their looks tomorrow, for I assure you Mr. Wingfield told me that he did not believe he had ever sent us off altogether in such good case. I trust, at least, that you do not think Mr. Knightley looking ill?" turning her eyes with affectionate anxiety towards her husband.
"Middling, my dear. I cannot compliment you. I think Mr. John Knightley very far from looking well."
"What's the matter, sir? Did you speak to me?" cried Mr. John Knightley, hearing his own name. "I'm sorry to find, my love, that my father does not think you looking well, but I hope it is only from being a little fatigued. I should have wished, however, as you know, that you had seen Mr. Wingfield before you left home." "My dear Isabella," exclaimed he hastily, "pray do not concern yourself about my looks. Be satisfied with doctoring and coddling yourself and the children, and let me look as I choose." "I did not thoroughly understand that you were telling your brother," cried Emma, "about your friend Mr. Graham's intending to have a bailiff from Scotland to look after his new estate. But will it answer? Will not the old prejudice be too strong?" And she talked in this way so long and successfully that, when forced to give her attention again to her father and sister, she had nothing worse to hear than Isabella's kind inquiry after Jane Fairfax. And Jane Fairfax, though no great favourite with her in general, she was, at that very moment, very happy to assist in praising. "That sweet, amiable Jane Fairfax," said Mrs. John Knightley. "It is so long since I have seen her, except now and then for a moment accidentally in town. What happiness it must be to her good old grandmother and excellent aunt when she comes to visit them. I always regret excessively on dear Emma's account that she cannot be more at Highbury, but now their daughter's married, I suppose Colonel and Mrs. Campbell will not be able to be parted with her at all. She would be such a delightful companion for Emma." Mr. Woodhouse agreed to it all, but added,
"Our little friend Harriet Smith, however, is just such another pretty kind of young person. You'll like Harriet. Emma could not have a better companion than Harriet."
"Oh, I'm most happy to hear it. But only Jane Fairfax one knows to be so very accomplished and superior, and exactly Emma's age." This topic was discussed very happily, and others succeeded of similar moment, and passed away with some similar harmony. But the evening did not close without a little return of agitation. The gruel came, and supplied a great deal to be said, much praise, and many comments, undoubting decision of its wholesomeness for every constitution, and pretty severe philippies upon the many houses where it was never met with tolerable. But, unfortunately, among the failures which the daughter had to instance, the most recent, and therefore most prominent, was in her own cook at Southend, a young woman hired for the time, who never had been able to understand what she meant by a basin of nice smooth gruel, thin, but not too thin. Often, as she had wished for and ordered it, she had never been able to get anything tolerable. Here was a dangerous opening. "Ah," said Mr. Woodhouse, shaking his head, and fixing his eyes on her with tender concern. The ejaculation in Emma's ear expressed, "Ah, there is no end of sad consequences of your going to Southend. It does not bear talking of." And for a little while she hoped he would not talk of it, and that silent rumination might suffice to restore him to the relish of his own smooth gruel. After an interval of some minutes, however, he began with, "I shall always be very sorry that you went to the sea this autumn, instead of coming here." "But why should you be sorry, sir? I assure you it did the children a great deal of good."
"And moreover, if you must go to the sea, it had better not have been to Southend. Southend is an unhealthy place."
Perry was surprised to hear you had fixed upon Southend. I know there is such an idea with many people, but indeed it is quite a mistake, sir. We all had our health perfectly well there, never found the least inconvenience from the mud, and Mr. Wingfield says that it is entirely a mistake to suppose the place unhealthy, and I am sure he may be depended on, for he thoroughly understands the nature of the air, and his own brother and family have been there repeatedly. You should have gone to Cromer, my dear, if you went anywhere. Perry was a week at Cromer once, and he holds it to be the best of all the sea-bathing places. A fine open sea, he says, and a very pure air. And, by what I understand, you might have had lodgings there quite away from the sea, a quarter of a mile off. Very comfortable. You should have consulted Perry. But, my dear sir, the difference of the journey. Only consider how great it would have been. 100 miles, perhaps, instead of 40. Ah, my dear, as Perry says, where health is at stake, nothing else should be considered. And if one is to travel, there's not much to choose between 40 miles and 100. Better not move at all. Better stay in London altogether than travel 40 miles to get into a worse air. This is just what Perry said. It seemed to him a very ill-judged measure. Emma's attempts to stop her father had been in vain, and when she had reached such a point as this, she could not wonder at her brother-in-law's breaking out. "Mr. Perry," said he, in a voice of very strong displeasure, "would do as well to keep his opinion till it is asked for. Why does he make it any business of his to wonder at what I do, at my taking my family to one part of the coast or another? I may be allowed, I hope, to use my judgment as well as Mr. Perry. I want his directions no more than his drugs." He paused, growing cooler in a moment, and added, with only sarcastic dryness, "If Mr. Perry can tell me how to convey a wife and 5 children a distance of 130 miles with no greater expense or inconvenience than a distance of 40, I should be as willing to prefer Cromer to Southend as he could himself." "True, true," cried Mr. Knightley, with most ready interposition. "Very true. That's a consideration indeed. But, John, as to what I was telling you of my idea of moving the path to Langham, of turning it more to the right, that it may not cut through the home meadows, I cannot conceive any difficulty. I should not attempt it if it were to be the means of inconvenience to the Highbury people. But if you call to mind exactly the present line of the path, the only way of proving it, however, will be to turn to our maps. I shall see you at the Abbey tomorrow morning, I hope, and then we will look them over, and you shall give me your opinion." Mr. Woodhouse was rather agitated by such harsh reflections on his friend Perry, to whom he had, in fact, though unconsciously, been attributing many of his own feelings and expressions. But soothing attentions of his daughters gradually removed the present evil, and the immediate alertness of one brother, and better recollections of the other, prevented any renewal of it. Chapter 13. There could hardly be a happier creature in the world than Mrs. John Knightley, in this short visit to Hartfield, going about every morning among her old acquaintance with her 5 children, and talking over what she had done every evening with her father and sister. She had nothing to wish otherwise, but that the days did not pass so swiftly. It was a delightful visit, perfect in being much too short. In general, their evenings were less engaged with friends than their mornings, but one complete dinner engagement, and out of the house too, there was no avoiding, though at Christmas. Mr. Weston could take no denial. They must all dine at Randall's one day. Even Mr. Woodhouse was persuaded to think it a possible thing in preference to a division of the party. How they were all to be conveyed, he would have made a difficulty if he could,
but as his son and daughter's carriage and horses were actually at Hartfield, he was not able to make more than a simple question on that head. It hardly amounted to a doubt, nor did it occupy Emma long to convince him that they might in one of the carriages find room for Harriet also. Harriet, Mr. Elton, and Mr. Knightley, their own especial set, were the only persons invited to meet them. The hours were to be early, as well as the numbers few, Mr. Woodhouse's habits and inclination being consulted in everything. The evening before this great event, for it was a very great event that Mr. Woodhouse should dine out on the 24th of December, had been spent by Harriet at Hartfield, and she had gone home so much indisposed with a cold that, but for her own earnest wish of being nursed by Mrs. Goddard, Emma could not have allowed her to leave the house. Emma called on her the next day, and found her doom already signed with regard to Randalls. She was very feverish, and had a bad sore throat. Mrs. Goddard was full of care and affection. Mr. Perry was talked of, and Harriet herself was too ill and low to resist the authority which excluded her from this delightful engagement, though she could not speak of her loss without many tears. Emma sat with her as long as she could, to attend her in Mrs. Goddard's unavoidable absences, and raise her spirits by representing how much Mr. Elton's would be depressed when he knew her state, and left her at last tolerably comfortable in the sweet dependence of his having a most comfortless visit, and of their all missing her very much. She had not advanced many yards from Mrs. Goddard's door when she was met by Mr. Elton himself, evidently coming towards it, and as they walked on slowly together in conversation about the invalid, of whom he, on the rumour of considerable illness, had been going to inquire, that he might carry some report of her to Hartfield, they were overtaken by Mr. John Knightley, returning from the daily visit to Donwell, with his 2 eldest boys, whose healthy, glowing faces showed all the benefit of a country run, and seemed to ensure a quick dispatch of the roast mutton and rice pudding they were hastening home for. They joined company and proceeded together. Emma was just describing the nature of her friend's complaint, a throat very much inflamed, with a great deal of heat about her, a low, quick pulse, etc., and she was sorry to find from Mrs. Goddard that Harriet was liable to very bad sore throats, and had often alarmed her with them. Mr. Elton looked all alarm on the occasion, as he exclaimed, "A sore throat? I hope not infectious. I hope not a putrid infectious sort. Has Perry seen her? Indeed, you should take care of yourself as well as of your friend. Let me entreat you not to run any risks. Why does not Perry see her?" Emma, who was not really at all frightened herself, tranquillized this excess of apprehension by assurances of Mrs. Goddard's experience and care, but as there must still remain a degree of uneasiness which she could not wish to reason away, which she should rather feed and assist than not, she added, soon afterwards, as if quite another subject, "It is so cold, so very cold, and looks and feels so very much like snow, that if it were to any other place, or with any other party, I should really try not to go out to-day, and dissuade my father from venturing. But as he has made up his mind, and does not seem to feel the cold himself, I do not like to interfere, as I know it would be so great a disappointment to Mr. and Mrs. Weston. But upon my word, Mr. Elton, in your case, I should certainly excuse myself. You appear to me a little hoarse already, and when you consider what demand of voice and what fatigues tomorrow will bring, I think it would be no more than common prudence to stay at home and take care of yourself tonight." Mr. Elton looked as if he did not very well know what answer to make, which was exactly the case, for though very much gratified by the kind care of such a fair lady, and not liking to resist any advice of hers, he had not really the least inclination to give up the visit. But Emma, too eager and busy in her own previous conceptions and views to hear him impartially, or see him with clear vision, was very well satisfied with his muttering acknowledgment of its being very cold, certainly very cold, and walked on, rejoicing in having extricated himself from Randalls, and securing him the power of sending to inquire after Harriet every hour of the evening. "You do quite right," said she. "We will make your apologies to Mr. and Mrs. Weston." But hardly had she so spoken when she found her brother was civilly offering a seat in his carriage, if the weather were Mr. Elton's only objection, and Mr. Elton actually accepting the offer with much prompt satisfaction. It was a done thing. Mr. Elton was to go, and never had his broad, handsome face expressed more pleasure than at this moment. Never had his smile been the stronger, nor his eyes more exulting than when he next looked at her. "Well," said she to herself, "this is most strange. After I had got him off so well, to choose to go into company and leave Harriet ill behind. Most strange indeed. But there is, I believe, in many men, especially single men, such an inclination, such a passion for dining out. A dinner engagement is so high in the class of their pleasures, their appointments, their dignities, almost their duties, that anything gives way to it. And this must be the case with Mr. Elton, a most valuable, amiable, pleasing young man, undoubtedly, and very much in love with Harriet. But still, he cannot refuse an invitation. He must dine out wherever he is asked. What a strange thing love is! He can see ready wit in Harriet, but will not dine alone for her." Soon afterwards, Mr. Elton quitted them, and she could not but do him the justice of feeling that there was a great deal of sentiment in his manner of naming Harriet at parting, in the tone of his voice whilst assuring her that he should call at Mrs. Goddard's for news of her fair friend, the last thing before he prepared for the happiness of meeting her again, when he hoped to be able to give a better report, and he sighed and smiled himself off, in a way that left the balance of approbation much in his favour. After a few minutes of entire silence between them, John Knightley began with, "I have never in my life saw a man more intent on being agreeable than Mr. Elton. It's downright labour to him where ladies are concerned. With men he can be rational and unaffected, but when he has ladies to please, every feature works." "Mr. Elton's manners are not perfect," replied Emma, "but where there is a wish to please, one ought to overlook, and one does overlook a great deal. Where a man does his best with only moderate powers, he will have the advantage of a negligent superiority. There is such perfect good temper and good will in Mr. Elton as one cannot but value." "Yes," said Mr. John Knightley, presently, with some slyness, "he seems to have a good deal of goodwill towards you." "Me?" she replied, with a smile of astonishment. "Are you imagining me to be Mr. Elton's object?" "Such an imagination has crossed me, I own, Emma, and if it never occurred to you before, you may as well take it into consideration now." "Mr. Elton is in love with me? What an idea!" "I do not say it is so, but you will do well to consider whether it is so or not, and to regulate your behaviour accordingly. I think your manners to him encouraging. I speak as a friend, Emma. You had better look about you, and ascertain what you do, and what you mean to do." "I thank you, but I assure you, you are quite mistaken. Mr. Elton and I are very good friends, and nothing more." And she walked on, amusing herself in the consideration of the blunders which often arise from a partial knowledge of circumstances, of the mistakes which people of high pretensions to judgment are for ever falling into, and not very well pleased with her brother for imagining her blind and ignorant, and in want of counsel. He said no more. Mr. Woodhouse had so completely made up his mind to the visit that in spite of the increasing coldness, he seemed to have no idea of shrinking from it, and set forward at last most punctually with his eldest daughter in his own carriage, with less apparent consciousness of the weather than either of the others, too full of the wonder of his own going, and the pleasure it was to afford at Randalls, to see that it was cold, and too well wrapped up to feel it. The cold, however, was severe, and by the time the second carriage was in motion, a few flakes of snow were finding their way down, and the sky had the appearance of being so overcharged as to want only a milder air to produce a very white world in a very short time. Emma soon saw that her companion was not in the happiest humour. The preparing and the going abroad in such weather, with the sacrifice of his children after dinner, were disagreeables at least, which Mr. John Knightley did not by any means like. He anticipated nothing in the visit that could be at all worth the purchase, and the whole of their drive to the vicarage was spent by him in expressing his discontent. "A man," said he, "must have a great good opinion of himself when he asks people to leave their own fireside, and encounter such a day as this, for the sake of coming to see him. He must think himself a most agreeable fellow. I could not do such a thing. It's the greatest absurdity. Actually snowing at this moment. The folly of not allowing people to be comfortable at home, and the folly of people's not staying comfortably at home when they can. If we were obliged to go out such an evening as this, by any call of duty or business, what a hardship we should deem it. And here we are, probably with rather thinner clothing than usual, setting forward voluntarily, without excuse, in defiance of the voice of nature, which tells man in everything given to his view or his feelings to stay at home himself, and keep under all shelter that he can. Here we are setting forward to spend 5 dull hours in another man's house, with nothing to say or hear that was not said or heard yesterday, and may not be said and heard again tomorrow. Going in dismal weather, to return probably in worse. 4 horses and 4 servants taken out for nothing, but to convey 5 idle shivering creatures into colder rooms and worse company than they might have had at home." Emma did not find herself equal to giving the pleased assent which no doubt he was in the habit of receiving, to emulate the "very true, my love," which must have been usually administered by his travelling companion. But she had resolution enough to refrain from making any answer at all. She could not be complying. She dreaded being quarrelsome. Her heroism reached only to silence. She allowed him to talk and arrange the glasses, and wrapped herself up without opening her lips. They arrived. The carriage turned, the step was let down, and Mr. Elton, spruce, black, and smiling, was with them instantly. Emma thought with pleasure of some change of subject. Mr. Elton was all obligation and cheerfulness. He was so very cheerful in his civilities indeed, that she began to think he must have received a different account of Harriet from what had reached her. She had sent while dressing, and the answer had been much the same, not better. "My report from Mrs. Goddard's," said she pleasantly, "was not so pleasant as I had hoped. Not better was my answer." His face lengthened immediately, and his voice was the voice of sentiment as he answered, "Oh, no. I am grieved to find I was on the point of telling you that when I called at Mrs. Goddard's door, which I did the very last thing before I returned to dress, I was told that Miss Smith was not better, by no means better, rather worse. Very much grieved and concerned. I had flattered myself that she must be better after such a cordial as I knew she had been given this morning." Emma smiled, and answered, "My visit was of use to the nervous part of her complaint, I hope, but not even I can charm away a sore throat. It is a most severe cold indeed. Mr. Perry has been with her, as you probably heard." "Yes, I imagined, That is, I did not.
He has been used to her in these complaints, and I hope tomorrow morning will bring us both a more comfortable report. But it is impossible not to feel uneasiness. Such a sad loss to our party today.
Dreadful.
Exactly so, indeed. She will be missed every moment. This was very proper. The sigh which accompanied it was very estimable, but it should have lasted longer. Emma was rather in dismay when only half a minute afterwards he began to speak of other things, and in a voice of the greatest alacrity and enjoyment. "What an excellent device," said he, "the use of a sheepskin for carriages. How very comfortable they make it. Impossible to feel cold with such precautions. The contrivances of modern days, indeed, have rendered a gentleman's carriage perfectly complete. One is so fenced and guarded from the weather that not a breath of air can find its way unpermitted. Weather becomes absolutely of no consequence. It's a very cold afternoon, but in this carriage we know nothing of the matter. Ha! Snows a little, I see."
"Yes," said John Knightley, "and I think we shall have a good deal of it."
Christmas weather," observed Mr. Elton. "Quite seasonable, and really extremely fortunate. We may think ourselves that it did not begin yesterday, and prevent this day's party, which might very possibly have done, for Mr. Woodhouse would hardly have ventured had there been much snow on the ground. But now it is of no consequence. This is quite the season, indeed, for friendly meetings. At Christmas everybody invites their friends about them, and people think little of even the worst weather. I was snowed up at a friend's house once for a week. Nothing could be pleasanter. I went for only one night, and could not get away until the very day se'nnight."
Mr. John Knightley looked as if he did not comprehend the pleasure, but said only coolly, "I cannot wish to be snowed up a week at Randall's." At another time Emma might have been amused, but she was too much astonished now at Mr. Elton's spirits for other feelings. Harriet seemed quite forgotten in the expectation of a pleasant party. "We're sure of excellent fires," continued he, "and everything in the greatest comfort. Charming people, Mr. and Mrs. Weston. Mrs. Weston, indeed, is much beyond praise, and he is exactly what one values. So hospitable, and so fond of society. It will be a small party, but where small parties are select, they are perhaps the most agreeable of any. Mr. Weston's dining-room does not accommodate more than 10 comfortably, and for my part I would rather, under such circumstances, fall short by 2 than exceed by 2. I think you'll agree with me," turning with a soft air to Emma. "I think I shall certainly have your approbation, though Mr. Knightley, perhaps, from being used to the large parties of London, may not quite enter into our feelings." "I know nothing of the large parties of London, sir. I never dine with anybody." "Indeed," with a tone of wonder and pity. "I had no idea that the law had been so great a slavery. Well, sir, the time must come when you will be paid for all this, when you will have little labour and great enjoyment." "My first enjoyment," replied John Knightley, as they passed through the sweep gate, "will be to find myself safe at Hartfield again." And that is the end to chapter 13. Intriguing, and it seems that my theory is in fact true, or at least Mr. Knightley feels the same way as I do. It's an interesting way of putting it, the way that Jane Austen has set up this series of events to test the characters, see the way that they react to Harriet's sickness, and I think it's done a good job of shaking Emma. She was so resolute in her idea that because she desired the match, the other two people would, of course, also desire it, that she was not really looking at the facts in any light. If even I can see it, then it must be pretty obvious. So, I'm looking forward to seeing how that progresses, and how the party progresses from here. It seems that Mr. John Knightley is not much in the mood for parties. Hopefully his companions and his doting and affectionate wife can raise his spirits enough so that he enjoys himself. Though I suspect there will be more drama to come. I was very interested in Chapter 12, the focus being almost entirely on the conversation around this dinner table. I really like the way that this book is doing that. It focuses on the way that the characters react to situations, the way that they react to one another, and display their worldview and their lives through their examination of the other people's lives. The way that Mr. Woodhouse talks about the seaside and his fears for bad air reflect not only his desire for his daughter's and her family's safety, but also his own fears and feelings of frailty in the world, but also his desire for an insular life where everyone he knows and loves is gathered around him so that he can be the centre of it all and put forth no effort to expend. It's fascinating, and I'm really enjoying learning more about these characters through moments like that, even if, realistically, they don't advance the story very much. They bring depth to the world. A very useful thing to think of in writing exercises in the future, to be sure. Thank you so much for joining me for these 2 chapters of Emma by Jane Austen. Thank you also for indulging that little sidetrack at the end there. I enjoy reflecting on what these books mean to me, and what they might mean to you as well. Please feel free to leave a comment below if you're interested in fostering more discussion about the nature of these books and what happens within their covers. And that, I think, is all I have for you today. Thank you again for joining me. It means so much for me to have you here on Soft Stories that I do not want to let you go, but we cannot sit here forever. And so it is with great sadness and with the expectation of wonderful stories to come that I must say to you that I wish you all the best and goodbye.